Turkey on a path to hold new elections as efforts to form a unity government failed. President Recep Tayyip Erdogan has said the only way out of the current impasse is the will of the people. How much of a political gamble is this call for a snap election? And what could further political uncertainty mean for Turkey now? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Jane Dutton. It has been a challenging few months for Turkey's AK party. It lost its 13-year majority rule after elections in June, partially because of the success of the pro-Kurdish HDP. It then tried to form a coalition government, an effort Turkey's Prime Minister says has now failed. As the country edges closer to new elections, Turks must also prepare for a period of instability at a time when their leaders have opened up a front against ISIL and the Kurdish PKK party. Lots to discuss today, but first, Al Jazeera's Bernard Smith helps get things started from Istanbul.
So it looks like Turkey will go to the polls again for the second time in 6 months after those inconclusive results of the June 7th election when the AK party lost its overall majority, forcing it to look for coalition partners. It's failed in that search, so now we're going to have what probably will be some sort of caretaker government, an election government it's called in Turkey, and that will sit in power until the elections at the end of October or end of November. Now, that means that for the first time, the AK party is going to have to share power. Sitting around the cabinet table, it will have to give ministerial positions to the other parties represented in parliament. That means the pro-Kurdish HDP in parliament for the first time will get ministerial posts, as will the secular opposition, the CHP, and another right-wing party, the MHP, although they probably won't take those seats. But it could be quite a fractious time in Turkish politics. These are all ideologically opposed parties. They agree on very little between themselves, so we can't expect this government to achieve an awful lot. And this is at a time when Turkey needs stability. It's facing a lot of security threats, not just on the border with Syria from ISIL. It's also increased its campaign against PKK positions in northern Iraq and in Turkey. And in return, the Turkish security services are being killed by the PKK. And there's also attacks going on from other groups in Istanbul and in other parts of the country. Bernard Smith, the Inside Story in Istanbul.
For more on this, I'm joined by our guests in Istanbul, Sinan Ugan, visiting scholar at Carnegie Europe and chairman of the Center for Economics and Foreign Policy Studies, an independent think tank in Washington, Kilic Kanat, research director at SETA Foundation, an assistant professor of political science at Penn State University, and in London, Ege Saçkin, Turkey specialist at IHS, country risk and political risk analyst. Gentlemen, welcome to Inside Story. Sinan Ugan, it seems that Erdogan is calling for new elections. Was this expected where you are?
Well, I mean, when the elections ended in June, on the 7th of June, on that evening, there was hope that Turkey could find a coalition government, that after many years of single-party rule, Turkey could end up in a coalition setting. However, that proved to be impossible for a number of reasons. First of all, the nationalist MHP refused to get together, or even indirectly supported by the predominantly Kurdish HDP. And then the Grand Coalition negotiations also collapsed between the incumbent AK party and the main opposition CHP. Many people believe that President Erdogan himself was not very enamored with that option of a grand coalition. And now we find ourselves facing the early elections, and most probably early next week, President Erdogan will call for early elections. It's one of his prerogatives under the Constitution, if within 45 days there has been no government set up.
Is he taking a gamble?
He is taking a gamble, in my belief. because according to the polls, the political configuration is not very likely to change after these elections. Although there is a slim chance, and that's what he's betting on, that the incumbent AK Party may regain its majority in parliament. AK Party can do so if the predominantly Kurdish HDP finds itself below the 10% national threshold. They had received 13% in the last round of elections. And the second option is for AK Party to win more nationalist votes. But both of them proved to be, for the time being, quite difficult to achieve. Support for HDP remains quite strong despite the upsurge in terrorist violence. And MHP seems to be well positioned to corner the nationalist vote.
Ergi Sachkin, you seem to be nodding in agreement there, particularly when I asked if he was gambling with his political future. Why is that?
I mean, by all means, because I think the main thing to understand here is that Erdogan has burned the bridges with the Kurdish population in Turkey. With the intensification we saw in his anti-PKK and, for that matter, anti-HDP rhetoric in the past several months, we understand that he is no longer aiming to gain any votes in that segment of the population. So his bet right now, his gamble, is mainly centered upon the prospect of gaining nationalist votes, as our esteemed colleague mentioned. And this is looking incredibly difficult. If anything, an increasing nationalist sentiment in the population would result in higher votes for the Nationalist Party. But one thing we do have to bear in mind is that for a long time, the AKP has been regarded in the country as the beacon of stability. And an increasing situation where we have a destabilization and intensification of violence in the country may result in a surge of votes for this particular reason for the AKP.
Kilic, kind of, with all of that in mind, the doubts thrown up by our guests, what do you think Erdogan was thinking when he called for these new elections? What's he got planned?
I think it is more than a gamble. It is what a president needs to do constitutionally when the political parties fail to form a coalition government, actually. So it is, I don't think it is a gamble. I think it is basically what he needed to do. I'm not sure what you meant by gamble, but there are certain issues from the very early on, actually, from the election night, that it was obvious for many that coalition is not possible. And realistic assessments even said at that point, argued that even if there's a if there's a big coalition between CHP and AKP, it would be a short-lived coalition, not a long coalition to rule the government. And then there would be governability problems, because there was several issues that CHP raised which was considered unacceptable by the AKP. MHP basically didn't want to be any part of the coalition, and HDP was isolated from the very beginning. And in
do you
regards
think they
to
couldn't come to any sort of compromise because they sense a possible victory, because they could see this as potentially being the downfall of Erdogan?
I don't think it is at this point. It is in 2009 when the local election, AK Party get 39% of the votes. There was similar kind of interpretations about the elections, but then in 2 years' time, in 2011, AK Party's votes surged to 49%. So we are not. It is not clear what would be the result of the election, because immediately after the June 7th elections, the polls demonstrated that there was an Ipsos poll actually the day after the elections showing that AK Party votes surged to 44%. So it's not clear at this point what would be the result. And I want to add one more point about the resolution process actually, and basically burning the bridges with the Kurdish population. In June 7th election, one of the most significant aspects of AK Party votes was AK Party lost some of the Kurdish votes, a major part of the Kurdish vote in Southeast. But this wouldn't mean an end for the resolution process, because these kind of processes, as we see in different parts of the world, has up and downs. And in some instances, the conflict may surge, but that wouldn't end the resolution process, especially in countries with ethnic conflict, for good. So I know that the situation is really difficult for Turkey, and I can understand why President Erdogan keeps saying a strong government, because it is not at this point, especially when you look at the geography and geopolitics of Turkey, it is not an easy situation with conflicts in Syria and Iraq, and the conflicts in Ukraine and Russia, and almost a bankrupt country, Greece, on its borders. So it is geopolitically in a difficult situation, and with its fight on ISIL and PKK at the same time, the call for a strong government is not only a wish of Erdogan, but I think it is the will of the people as well.
Okay, we'll talk more about that a little bit later on, what Turkey is facing on its borders. But if Erdogan calls for snap elections on Sunday, looks like he will at this stage, the polls will open on November the 22nd, and Turkey will need an interim government to rule in the meantime. But even that coalition may prove difficult to form. The pro-Kurdish People's Democratic Party, known as HDP, has said it is willing to join an election government, and leaders of the CHP, Turkey's second largest party, say it'll only take part if HDP does. But the nationalist MHP refuses to work in a government with a pro-Kurdish party. And while Parliament could vote to keep the current cabinet in place until November, the MHP has said it would vote against that as well, and the other opposition parties would likely do the same. Sinan Ugan, it sounds incredibly complicated. If they couldn't come up with any sort of agreement before this interim government, how are they going to work together in a very important time for Turkey?
This is a constitutionally stipulated scenario, namely if Parliament does not have the ability to come together and vote for the continuation of the current government, be it a minority government or just for until election time, the only way forward is indeed for the setup of an election government, which would incorporate representatives from all the parties represented in Parliament, proportionally to their seats in Parliament. This is the constitutional mandate. However, as you rightly pointed out, the nationalist MHP is unwilling to send its representatives to sit together with representatives from the Kurdish party. So in all likelihood, it's going to be a coalition, election government with three parties and a number of independent candidates to fill in the seats. Now, the real issue is the longer Turkey waits under these conditions for the specific date of the election, the more difficult it will be for this government to manage this transition. But yesterday, the High Electoral Board stated that they would be ready to hold elections within 45 days. So I would say that at most within 2 months, Turkey can go back to the polls, which would actually limit the exposure of this government to many of the challenges that Turkey faces today, some of which are very critical.
Yeah, you were saying how difficult it's going to be to manage this transition. And Egi Sachkin, how difficult is it in this time going to be to manage the growing violence that we're seeing not only on Turkey's borders, but within the country itself?
I mean, it's definitely a big issue currently, the level of violence, especially on behalf of the PKK. Especially today, we saw just before this show, 8 soldiers were killed in the southeast. And this is likely to intensify in the lead up to the prospective election later this year. Especially because, as we made the point earlier on, the government probably calculates that it stands to benefit from an intensification of the violence in terms of increased nationalist votes that would possibly give it the incremental push necessary to attain the majority representation.
So you're saying that the AK party and possibly the PKK could benefit from the increase in violence, with in mind the fact that HDP was so successful in the last elections?
I think you hit the hammer on the nail, because the PKK also they definitely, the reason they're engaging in this level of activity currently is because they are unhappy about the success the HDP experienced in the election, mainly because it threatens to strip the PKK of the dominant position they held until now in the center of Turkey's Kurdish political movement. As a legal, widely accepted and democratic party, arguably, the HDP would stand to cast a shadow over the relevance of the PKK into the future. And that's why I think the PKK is it's an existential reaction to an extent.
Kilic Kanat, in this uncertain time for Turkey, this increase in violence, what role do you see now for the military? Because we know in the past that the military would often step in when there were areas of instability.
A couple things, actually. One, about your question. Immediately after the election, those who were extremely skeptical about the process of forming coalition government and ruling of the coalition government, they were constantly emphasized that in the periods of coalition government in the recent political history of Turkish Republic, actually, always brought a tutelage system, a crisis of governance, and problems about forming a coalition government, and then it would pave the way for the military to step in. So there was serious concerns. Even those who are kind of skeptical about parliamentary system constantly emphasize that parliamentary system and the coalition governments, when they come together in Turkey, unfortunately, this is the structural problem of maybe Turkish democracy. It brought in the military as a last resort, and military gains at those points, military gains significant support of the people as well to step in. So this is a critical period, although since AK Party government, the tutelage system were broken and an active civilian control of the military was achieved by the government. And there is now, especially among the, we don't see a lot of demonstrations asking the government to step in Turkey. So there is a democratic maturity, at certain level, democratic maturity in Turkey, that nobody wants a military government or a military coup in Turkey. But we have to be still careful about this situation. And secondly, regarding the nationalist, the conflict in Turkey right now, especially the attacks of the PKK, and how the election can bring nationalist votes to AK Party, I think I'm more skeptical about that position, because MHP is a nationalist party, and it's one of the first precondition for forming coalition government was to basically to end the resolution process. And at this point, in this conflict situation, I don't think AK Party would gain a lot of nationalist votes, and take advantage of the situation.
Okay.
They don't have an intention, or or it will not be possible to pull a lot of nationalist votes at this point.
Okay, let's talk more about the AK Party, seeing as you raised it there. We've been saying that the AK Party had been riding a 13-year streak of election victories, a success driven by the massive economic growth Turkey has seen since 2002. Growth which empowered people across the country, particularly in more marginalized areas of Anatolia. As Prime Minister, Erdogan was also able to transform the role of the military, which we were talking about, pushing them out of politics. But for all of his achievements, it is Erdogan, who some say is now a liability for his former party, accused by his critics of being divisive and even power-hungry. The AK Party now faces the challenge of explaining to Turks why it should rule by itself, even as Turkey's political landscape has changed. Sinan, what do you think the future of the AK Party is right now? Can it survive in its current state?
Well, AK Party has been an enormously successful political endeavor. Since it was established in 2001, it came to power in 2002, and it won all the elections that it participated in. It is a political vehicle that has taken advantage of the pool of votes in Turkey on the conservative right. And it remains the single largest party in Turkey. And despite its many drawbacks and failures since 2011 in terms of both advancing the democratic rule of law, but also in terms of not being able to instill the economy with a new momentum after 2011, it is still likely to win the next round of elections. So the question is really whether AK Party will be able to regain the majority that it has lost in parliament, to set up a single party government and to allow President Erdogan to operate the way that he wants, almost as a de facto executive president of the country, or we will again end up in a coalition setting, which to me is the more likely scenario. So in that sense, I don't agree with this statement that we should denigrate the coalition as a matter of principle, because that's the path ahead for Turkey. It is very unlikely that we shall see the emergence of a single party government, and therefore the Turkish body politic should be able to demonstrate the maturity to come to an agreement in a coalition setting, which would enable Turkey to start to address some of its deep problems, which has been incidentally also strengthened or deepened by the prevailing degree of polarization in society.
Ege, do you think that the AK Party can continue in that vein with Erdogan being a major player, or is it time for some in the party to look past him, possibly?
To an extent, the AKP's underperformance in the June election was a manifestation of a crossroads the party has arrived to at this point in time, in terms of choosing a path between, on the one hand, subjection to the direction and power of President Erdogan, and allowing the president to continue with the exercise of its informal influence over the party, and perhaps paving the way for constitutional changes that would instate him as an executive president, or on the other hand, sticking to the principles that were the main factors for the party's success in the initial decade of its rule.
But yeah, as you say, I mean, the party and Erdogan himself brought a lot of achievements to the country, both politically and economically, becoming a big political player, Kilic. But as you mentioned earlier on, Turkey is now at odds with so many of its neighbors, and AK's party's foreign policy when it was set up was to do just the opposite.
One of the most significant if we want to understand the issue about the AK Party and AK Party votes and what will bring and what will an early election will bring to AK Party, is there is usually an understated and underemphasized impact of economy for the and correlation between the situation in the economy and the AK Party votes. And since 2002, we constantly see that when the economy is doing well, AK Party, especially getting middle class voters and doing well in the elections. And because of that, in a case of an early election, there will be the voters will go to the polls, and there will be two different basically fears. One is a more unstable fear of a more unstable Turkey, which could mobilize more AK Party voters, which AK Party actually failed to mobilize in the last election. And secondly, there may be the situation of another coalition government if AK Party failed to mobilize those voters. And secondly, in regards to foreign policy and AK Party, what we see the changes in the AK Party's the geopolitics of Turkey right now is not very much related with Turkish foreign policy, but the changes in the regional political architecture, actually.
Okay.
Turkey and Syria was doing really well until the Arab Spring. Turkey and Iraq was doing well until the Maliki government started its sectarian policies.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there, unfortunately.
To blame Turkey for this.
Kilic, excuse me, cutting you off. Thank you for your thoughts, and you too, Sinan Ogan and Ege Saçkın. Thank you for watching this episode of Inside Story. If you have any comments about today's show, you can get in touch by going to our program page at aljazeera.com, or you can post your comments on facebook.com/AJ Inside Story, or tweet us at AJ Inside Story. From me, Jane Dutton, and the rest of the team, goodbye and thank you for watching.